From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown. My guest today is Howard Amos. Howard is a journalist and editor with a focus on Russia. He started out as a journalist with the Moscow Times in the 2010s and also spent a year as editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times in 2022 after its team left Russia because of wartime censorship. Howard has a deep knowledge of Russia's Pskov region, which shares borders with the EU and NATO. He is the author of Russia Starts Here, Real Lives in the Ruins of Empire. Howard, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Glad to have you here. So one of the things that stands out about the book is that you wrote it on both sides of two enormous historical ruptures, the COVID period and the full Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. You started the book in 2019. You traveled back and forth. You left Russia after the invasion, but you also went back in 2023 after most Western journalists had left. I'd be curious to hear about that decision, why it was important to go back, what you found during the last trip in Russia. How did you feel when you first arrived?
Right. So, yeah, absolutely. The book was, when I was writing and researching the book, that was COVID and the full-scale invasion. And I mean, what it meant practically was that it was quite late. I couldn't travel to Russia during COVID, and then again at the start of the invasion. So it took much longer for the book to come together, which editors weren't too thrilled about. But yeah, so I mean, COVID basically didn't really have any sort of major impact on the book itself. It just meant, practically speaking, it was harder to get to Russia, and the whole process was delayed. I couldn't go to do research there. The war was more sort of important. I did in the early stages of the war. I did wonder whether I would have to sort of rethink the book conceptually. I didn't do that in the end, but I did add a chapter in about, which we might get to later, about the widow of a Russian soldier who was killed in Ukraine. And the war kind of permeates the book throughout, really. It comes up in a lot of the other chapters as well. And so, yeah, I was in Moscow. I was sort of traveling between the UK, where I'm from, and Russia between 2019 and 2022. I was in Moscow when the invasion began. I left very quickly after that. Along with
Set that scene. What was that like?
So it was. My memories are quite hazy, really, of that period. It was just I wasn't actually. I was there to do research for the book primarily, so I wasn't actually doing any journalism at that point. So it was just like everyone. I think it involved a lot of reading the news and being glued to Telegram, and the sort of total despair of a lot of Russian journalists and Russian friends. A lot of them also ended up leaving. I do remember walking around Moscow, just a very sort of sunny day. That's when there were sort of queues outside ATMs to get money out, and just the whole thing felt very surreal. Most people, the overwhelming majority of people, just sort of walking around doing their daily business, and that sort of disconnect between what was on the phone and in front of your eyes was very striking. And then, yeah, I left. I think it was about 2 weeks after the invasion, when a lot of journalists were leaving, when there were rumors about martial law and closing borders and all these things. And so, yeah, I lived in Armenia for 2 years after that, and I came back to Russia in 2023. So it was almost exactly a year after the war started. I came back because I needed to finish the research for the book. That was the motivation. I probably wouldn't have done otherwise. I was in Moscow, and I was also in Pskov and other places in Pskov region. At the time, I was the editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times, so I came back on a visa that I got the Moscow Times. At that point, the Moscow Times still had its an office in Moscow, although there were no journalists there. That was a sort of period sort of the initial sort of hysteria or, the fear had sort of faded slightly, and some Western journalists were going back occasionally to Russia at that point. It was just before Evan Gershkovich got arrested, which is another sort of important moment. So
that caused a real chilling effect for journalists. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So there was a real chilling effect at the beginning. Then it sort of seemed to, maybe it was okay to go back a bit, and then Evan was arrested, and that really changed things. So fortunately, it was before that happened. I was questioned at the border for an hour, 45 minutes or something.
What did they ask you?
It felt very much as if it was the standard procedure, which I think it was for a lot of foreigners entering the country at that point. Sort of very sort of nothing that felt it was tailored to me. I didn't feel like the guy on the other side of the table had any particularly knowledge of me or what I was doing or what I'd done in Russia before. The most bizarre question to me was, so I travel. My wife is Russian, and we traveled back together that time, and she was sort of, and they asked me about her, and this guy who was questioning me, he asked me at the time, I was completely baffled by this question at the time. He asked, what do my parents think of my wife? And I didn't know where he was coming from or what he was thinking. And I said, I sort of looked surprised and said, they love her very much, blah, 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 something like that. Only with hindsight, I kind of assumed it was he thought that everyone in the West hates Russians, and that I think that was what was motivating his question. Anyway, it was I was totally baffled by it, and at the time, and I think that was the explanation. But I mean, apart from that, there was sort of lots of it wasn't. Yeah, again, I didn't feel like they knew who I was, and it was felt like they were just asking questions off a form. But being back in Russia was. I mean, what I always say when people ask me about this is it was this disconnect between, the previous year I'd lived in Armenia. Professionally I was editing the Moscow Times, and that was we were talking and reporting and writing about the war and the consequences of the war all day long. Most of the people I knew in Yerevan were also Russians who'd left, out of opposition to the war or, to avoid getting mobilized. So the conversations with them was always dominated by the war and what was going on. Even if I came back to the UK, that was what people wanted to, talk about and ask me about. In Moscow, no one wanted to talk about the war. It was this, if you wanted to forget about, what was the terrible things that were going on in Ukraine, Moscow was the best place to do it. And I think that was a mixture of people being scared, not wanting to talk about it with a foreigner, particularly in public places.
Which sounds very Soviet, like Russians being afraid to talk to foreigners.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself, on the metro in Moscow, like flicking through the news on my phone. I was like, maybe I shouldn't be reading Medusa on my, phone. Someone might see, there had been cases of, people being reported to the police. People looking over the shoulders of people on their phones and then reporting.
Informers, also very Soviet. Yeah.
Yeah. So I caught myself, thinking that, and but also I think for a lot of the people who I knew, it was like it wasn't so much that they were scared; it's just it was too painful, right? So at this point, it'd been going on for a year, and people just didn't know what to say, and the way you deal with painful things sometimes is by ignoring them and sort of burying them. And I think that was very common as well, like just focusing on the things you can control, the sort of day to day, and forgetting about the things going on in Ukraine. The other striking thing about being in Moscow was that I'd lived there at that point for on and off, but for the best part of a decade, in my late 20s, early 30s, and I had lots of friends and people I knew from work and all the rest of it. And when I went back there, I barely knew anyone. Like almost my entire circle, from those years in Moscow had left the country. So that was very odd as well, going back to this place where ostensibly I spent all this time and knew all these people, but there was actually very few people who I still knew in the city.
Yeah. So a very palpable sense of having crossed that threshold and being under the shadow of a taboo.
Yeah. There was the other very striking thing. I went to, as I said, I went to Pskov during that month,
Mhm.
and the only real outward sign of the war in Moscow or Pskov, or I think probably any other Russian city at that point, was they'd have a few sort of recruiting posters up for the army. But apart from that, nothing, on the streets visible that the war was going on, and hundreds of Russian soldiers being killed every day. But in Pskov, for the book, I went to there's this cemetery just outside the city, which was famously used to bury soldiers killed in Ukraine, particularly paratroopers from the local paratrooper unit. And I went there just to get a sense of how many new graves, and just to see the place. I turned up and they were about to have a funeral, right? There were soldiers in cars, waiting. There was the grave diggers. It was obviously that a funeral was about to begin. So I didn't. That was no place for a Western journalist to be. So I very quickly turned around and left. But it very struck me. But the surface, everything seemed fine. But you don't have to, dig very deep or scratch much below the surface to, in the particularly in places like Pskov region, as I'm sure we'll come on to, the sort of the day-to-day, horror of the war was very real.
So the visual changes come in stages. First, you get the recruiting posters, then you get the expanding cemetery, then you get the amputees begging on public transit.
Mm-hmm.
All comes in stages. Well, your subject is Pskov, so let's go into that. So this region was once home to a medieval city-state that had relations with Western Europe. It's home to Alexander Pushkin's family estate. It's got important religious sites associated with the Kremlin's triumphalist vision of Orthodox Christianity, particularly the idea of the Third Rome. Russia is the kind of last true center of Christianity. It's also poor. It's losing its population. More soldiers from there have died in Ukraine than from any other region. Tell us how you got to know that part of Russia.
So I first went to Pskov region in 2007. So this was before I became a journalist. I was at university in the UK, and I saw an advertisement that for a Russian charity was looking for volunteers.
Where was the advertisement?
I think it was in an email. So I studied history, but it was a friend who studied modern languages, and she had an email because they were looking for people who spoke Russian, and I'd been fortunate. I'd done 4 years of Russian at school.
Mm-hmm.
So I think she knew I was interested in going back to Russia, so she forwarded me the email, and that's where I saw it. So I went to this summer camp at this orphanage in sort of rural Pskov region for a month in the summer of 2007. And that was, at that point, it was the second time I'd been to Russia. I'd spent time in Moscow and St. Petersburg before then. But this sort of month, so we lived in a nearby village, and every day we went to the orphanage. There were sort of 30 volunteers who went to the orphanage and did various sort of developmental games, and camping trips, and sort of sports days, and plays, and that sort of thing. But we were sort of total immersion for a month, and we lived in this little village, and the orphanage was. There were two things that were eye-opening. One was the orphanage. I'd never seen anything remotely like that. It was, there was about, at that point, I think there were about 100, 120 kids, all with very, quite serious mental and physical disabilities. So that made a very deep impression. And then also it was living in the Russian countryside, which was seemed worlds away from the bits of Russia that I'd seen in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Yeah. Tell me about some of the. Well, you explored the region. It's a large region. Tell me a bit about the religious history.
Of Pskov region.
Yeah.
Well, it's so Pskov region was one of the uh, uh, places where the Vikings first came. The Rurikids, one of the Rurikid brothers, first came to Russia in the 9th century.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of very old Slavic land, as it were, and then obviously it became Orthodox when Prince Vladimir of Kiev converted to Orthodoxy, and has been Orthodox ever since. It's often a sort of two ways of sort of seeing Pskov region historically, I think. The first is, so it was always on the kind of the edge of the until the Russian Empire expanded westwards in the, I'm talking the 17th century, 18th century here. It was always on the frontier. So for half a millennia, it was on the frontier of orthodoxy. So it was the site of invasions going east and west. There was a lot of fighting. Pskov was put under siege many, many times. But it was also the center of this medieval republic, which notably and importantly was quite democratic. So they elected the leaders of the republic. The Pskov city walls were built to protect the whole population of the city. It's the only city in Russia where the city walls protect everyone, not just the rich and famous in the Kremlin in the very center. It was very tied into the West via trading. So legally it drew much more Western legal norms rather than sort of Slavic traditions. So there's sort of two ways of seeing it, as I was saying. So one is this sort of watchtower of orthodoxy of Russia perched on this sort of Western edge, fighting off the invaders, be they Teutonic Knights, Poles, Lithuanians, Nazi Germans, whatever. Or you can see Pskov as this sort of quasi-democratic place with ties to Europe, a sort of bridge, a gateway between Russia and the West. So yeah, and then coming back to what you're asking about the religious history, what I focus on in the book is this site called the Caves Monastery, which is this a very old monastery, which now is it's like a few kilometers from the Estonian border, so it's right on the very edge of western edge of Russia. And it's significant in Orthodoxy because it was the only monastery that was never closed down under the Soviet Union, because for that interwar period, that territory was part of independent Estonia. So that, and the Estonians didn't shut it down, whereas the Soviets shut down all the monasteries at that point. So it has this sort of unbroken lineage going right back to the start, which makes it very significant within Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
But there are lots of monasteries and churches in Pskov more broadly. But that the Caves Monastery is the sort of the really significant one.
Yeah. And the depopulation seems to be a defining feature. In fact, you almost start the book with that, with the story of Nina and Nikolai in Baranova.
Yeah, the depopulation is one of the things I found particularly fascinating about Russia, and I think it's crucial to understanding. It's this sort of backdrop to people's lives, which is very important in explaining why people think and act the way they do. And Pskov region is, if you want to talk about depopulation, Pskov region is a very striking place to do it. It's one of the fastest depopulating regions in Russia, although it is this it's very old Slavic land. This is not the Siberian expanses in Siberia, which joined Russia later. Pskov region was there from the very beginning. It's also it's relatively close to St. Petersburg, from the city of Pskov. It's was it like 4 or 5 hour drive to St. Petersburg. Moscow is an overnight train.
Yeah, close by Russian standards. Yeah.
Close by Russian standards, yeah.
Or North American
the
standards. Yeah.
Moscow is 12 hours by train, and then you're right there next to it, Estonia, Latvia, and Belarus. But despite this, it is the depopulation is severe, and every village that you go to has abandoned houses in it, and it's not difficult to find whole villages where they're are entirely abandoned, fields that were, you travel with people who, older people who knew what it was like in the Soviet Union, and they can sort of, you drive past like a young forest or whatever, and they'll say, oh, in the Soviet period that was, they used to plant, I don't know, whatever, rye there or something. It was like fields that were farmed. It's sort of rewilding by, not by design. And so I was very interested in what this does. This is a gradual process which has evolved since really the mid-30s and collectivization. So like almost 100 years. So if you look at a graph of Pskov region's population, it peaks in the early 30s, and then it's down ever since. And that's not bottoming out. It's the other thing. It's still going down.
Yeah. Right. So let's go back to you mentioned the orphanage. So when I'm reading for the podcast, I'm often attuned to those elements of the book that resonate with Orwell's essays, as well as the novels. One of Orwell's famous essays was called Such Were the Joys. It was about how children related to a snobbish private boys' school in England, which Orwell attended, and offers all kinds of insights about how people are trained to relate to status and authority. But you mentioned you spent time working at this Pskov region children's home, at the very opposite end of the social spectrum, where the state raises orphans. It would be interesting to hear more about how the children related to that institution, how that institution relates to the wider Russian society, and also about your friendship with the photographer Dima Markov, who documented those places.
Okay, yeah. So it's probably important to say that so I first went to the orphanage in 2007. And I went there over a period of 15 years.
Right, so you kept traveling back.
Yeah, I kept traveling back, and I took part in the summer camp regularly for a number of years. I lived there for a year and did a lot of volunteering at the orphanage, and then I was actually in charge of the summer camp. I put it all together a bit later on. So I spent a lot of time, cumulatively I spent a lot of time there over quite a long period, and the first thing to say is it changed, right? These places, these sorts of state institutions in the, they really fell apart in the 90s, and the early 2000s was a very grim time, from a material point of view, right? And when I started going there, I think it was the beginning. It was just when the money, from the rising oil prices in the 2000s and the 2010s, when that really started to trickle down to places. So the story of the period in which I've been going there is of the greater material prosperity of places like this. So they materially they have got a lot better than they were 15, 20 years ago. There's no.
It's significant that the resources have been allocated to places like that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate it. They're not they don't have huge amounts of money. But if you went there now and you went there 20 years ago, I mean, it's obvious there's a big difference, and that has, I think, been a bit of a change in thinking about how to look after vulnerable kids like these. But, and there's a big but hovering here, is that ultimately kids in orphanages, they become highly institutionalized. They're basically it's very hard for them to ever live independently. And, there's lots of, research about what being in an orphanage does to kids. And what I'm trying to say is the essence of the system hasn't changed. The walls might be freshly painted. There might be lifts for kids in wheelchairs. They might not lock the kids up at, overnight and during the naps during the day, but the essence of the system is still the same. And when I was writing the book and when I was sort of thinking about this period of time that I spent involved with this orphanage and how to kind of encapsulate that, the way I sort of packaged it for the book was to try and argue that, so there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of kids who've been through orphanages in Russia. Orphanages vary. There are different categories of them, but I think it's a sort of typical Russian institution, which, is maybe quite similar if you're in the military or if you're in one of Russia's prisons. Certain, I don't want to push this too far, but, certain elements, maybe if you're in, state-run nurseries or schools or, so there are large amounts of probably the majority of the Russian population has had some sort of extended experience of a Russian institution. Obviously the orphanage that I saw was a very extreme example of this, but still I think there are ideas and things that you can draw out and apply them more broadly. And it's certainly good to be aware of these places.
I'm struck by your description of how kind of expansive the system is, and I couldn't help but think of the Gulag Archipelago, right? This kind of archipelago of institutions which are replicated across the country, which are not in this case, not set up for punishment, but they do reflect the wider society.
Yeah, exactly. And kids from this particular type of orphanage, and kids from other orphanages as well, what often happens to them is, they turn 18, and they're incapable of living independently, so they're transferred to what are called adult institutions, where they live until the end of their lives. It's a sort of these adult institutions are a bit of a cross between sort of what we'd see as old people's homes, so elderly people unable to take care of themselves with no family support. Young kids who've been institutionalized to the extent that they can't live independently. And then I think, some people with chronic mental illness, that sort of, so it's a sort of, so those campaigning in Russia to reform these places or to dissolve them entirely, I've definitely made that comparison with this sort of Gulag archipelago. And it gets very little coverage in, people in Russia, I think a lot of people in Russia are unaware of the conditions in these places, and certainly, there's very little written about in English as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be wary about using the word lucky, but I was very lucky to have ended up in a place like this, because it's very difficult to get access to these places, sort of conjunction of various circumstances that meant this charity-run volunteer summer camp took place at this orphanage, and I got this glimpse into this world, which certainly as a journalist in Moscow, you'd never get a glimpse into that sort of world.
Why was it open to foreigners at that time?
So it's a very interesting history. So they and most of the volunteers on the summer camp were Russians, so there were sort of 5 or 6 foreigners. And the summer camp had begun in the early 2000s. When things were, still quite open, perhaps through incompetence and lack of money than anything else. But I can't quite remember. But there were foreigners involved in going. They went there for the first time, I think, with the Russians. I can't quite remember the story. But then, and this summer camp, crucially, I think the director of the orphanage was open to this at the time, and they allowed the summer camp to be set up. So a lot of these things are quite dependent on chance and on personalities as well. And once this sort of annual tradition had been established of these volunteers, again, mostly Russians, the foreigners were the exception. They sort of gave it a bit of sort of exotic spice, I think. It was, but it was run by a Russian charity, a Russian-based charity, and most of the volunteers were Russian. And once this tradition had been established, it was, I think the people there, who worked at the orphanage could see the benefits of it, and it still happens to this day.
Yeah. And I remember that the kids conceptualized the presence of the foreigners as them being Muscovites.
Yeah,
Muscovites were these different people who came in from outside.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, intellectually it was very hard for them, because a lot of them had, mental disabilities, to understand that was other countries or people from other countries or other languages was totally, was a impossible concept really for them to get their heads around, and they never saw foreigners apart from this sort of month in the summer. And yeah, everyone, all the volunteers were referred to as Muscovites, or the Muscovites have arrived from the summer camp. Yeah. So and then obviously, I mean, my Russian was still very far from perfect, but back then it was even more rudimentary, and the kids are all a bit baffled why there were these these few foreigners who didn't speak Russian very well. Yeah.
Yeah. And tell me about Dima Markov.
So Dima Markov, he also went to Pskov region for the first time for that summer camp in 2007.
Right. So I should set him up by saying he's a very well-known Russian photographer who died fairly recently.
Right. Yeah. So I first got to know him at that summer camp. He was just another one of the volunteers. He wasn't famous at that point, very far from it. He'd grown up just outside Moscow. He'd worked as a journalist for a bit. At that point, he started taking photographs. He was also, should say, he was a heroin addict, and he was an addict at that point, and he eventually died of an overdose. But yeah, I remember him from that first summer camp. He had a camera with him. He was like, that was very obviously his identity was tied up with that. He took thousands of photos of the kids and the other volunteers, and I think for him it was as a photographer and as a journalist, for him it was also an opportunity to have this window onto this very closed world. So you had this 4 weeks to spend almost all your time with these kids and get to know them and to understand their world and how they saw the world. And so yeah, like me, he was very profoundly affected by this experience. He ended up so Dima, sort of throughout his lifetime, he mixed photography and sort of charitable work. He was very involved in both throughout his life. And he went on after the summer camp to found this sort of children's village, this sort of halfway house for kids to help get them out of the sort of institutional environment, out of the system, where he worked for several years. And then later he moved to the city of Pskov, which was like it's about an hour and a half's drive from the orphanage. And he began to take photos purely on his phone, right? He ditched the camera and began to use Instagram. And that's when he really became famous and well known. And his images, I think they're very distinctive. Once you've seen one, they're quite recognizable. He was a master of composition, so all his photos are brilliantly put together. Some of them look like paintings. They're so amazingly sort of stitched together. And his subjects reflect, his interests in, charity work and social work. And he tended to take photos of the most marginal people in society. So, whether it was orphans, the very poor, the disabled, the homeless, conscripts,
kind of like
very elderly.
Dostoevsky territory. Yeah.
Yeah. I think someone once said of him that if Dostoevsky had an iPhone, they would have got an Instagram account like Dima's Instagram account. And he also, the other thing is the settings for his photos are always sort of the peripheries of Russian cities, the sort of, there's lots of, sort of images of kids jumping off garages or, the crumbling 1960s apartment blocks, these sort of, like, to anyone who spent any time in Russia, very familiar landscapes, but ones maybe you don't see that often represented, um, in the West. And so Dima, just to finish the story about Dima, he did become very famous, and when the full scale invasion happened, he stayed in Russia. I mean, he could have left if he wanted to, but he decided to stay. I mean, I think he didn't speak.
That's a certain type of Russian artist that they're not leaving no matter what. It's like Pasternak, it's Vladimir Vysotsky.
Yeah, I mean, he would kind of say that. Like, I mean, I asked him about it. He was like, no one wants me over there. I mean, and I could he didn't speak English very well. He was obviously a prodigiously talented photographer, but his milieu was, Russia, and if you would have taken him out of that, I think he would have been lost. He wouldn't have known what to do. So yeah, it's kind of as an artist, it's very difficult to imagine him being able to leave. I mean, obviously, as a person, he had the money. He could have, and he was very talented. He could have somehow made a living outside, of Russia. But he made the decision to stay, and I think that to a certain extent that tore him apart a bit. I think because he was horrified by what was happening with Ukraine, although he was always, very patriotic, to the point of being sometimes a bit nationalist in what he said. And, he was horrified by it. And, he lived in Pskov. He saw a lot of, what we were talking about earlier, the amputees, people who came back, had had their lives wrecked, young conscripts being sent off. He saw a lot of that. I was quite close to that sort of horror of it. But yeah, he overdosed, and he died the day before Navalny was killed in a Russian prison colony. So yeah, I think, I mean, you don't want to sort of push it too far, but I think that sort of remaining in Russia, with all the pressures and contradictions and all the rest of it that imposed on him, I think that was one of the reasons why he died. And he was very young. He was only in his 40s.
Yeah. I mean, we were commenting on his maybe a nationalistic streak. I mean, it got me thinking about propaganda and how when you live in a heavily propagandized environment, you may feel like you're immune to it. You may think that you're immune to it, but it's always having some effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. Often when I was working in Moscow as a journalist, I would make an effort to watch the state news, because I thought it was kind of important. It was important. I think it was important. It is important to understand what they're saying. But even if you're watching it critically, and it does have it does sort of get sort of at the back of your head, that it sort of leaves a certain, you're like, oh, is that true? Or like, is that right? Or if that's right, then it does have a very corrosive effect. Yeah.
I remember doing a homestay while I was doing a Russian language course, and a nice lady, actually, in her 50s, but she listened to a lot of radio and TV. And when I came home, she would be mad about the West, some aspect of the West, and we'd have to talk about that aspect of the West that she'd heard was outrageous on the radio.
Yeah, I think that's a familiar experience that a lot of people who spent time in Russia have had.
Yeah. Well, speaking of propaganda, I mean, quite a few of your chapters are on more traditional Orwellian themes like history, memory, in relation to propaganda. One that really stands out for me is the chapter Flag Over the Reichstag, in which you really delve into the true versus the official accounts of how the hammer and sickle was raised over Berlin in 1945. Tell us about that. And the Pskov connection, of course.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this. This is one of the most interesting chapters for me to research. So I so yeah, so the I mean, I think a lot of people are aware, like the Reichstag became this big symbol for the Red Army when they were you know moving westward in 1944, 1945. Who was going to be first to capture Berlin, and the sort of capture of Berlin was to be symbolized by the seizing of the Reichstag, which is, you know, right in the very center of the city. And everyone knows, I think, that famous photograph that was taken by a Red Army photographer of the red flag with the hammer and sickle on top of the Reichstag, and there's a few Red Army soldiers there, and then there's the sort of smoke billowing out over Berlin. So it's a very sort of iconic image. But I came across the story of this guy from Pskov, a guy called Mikhail Minin, who was a soldier in the Red Army. He joined up at the beginning of the war, fought all the way to Berlin. And he was the one who said, he said he was the first person to raise the red flag over the Reichstag. He was in a small group in the sort of first wave of the attack on the building. They fought their way to the top, and he tied this quite small red flag onto the top of the building. But if you look at the official version of events, like it was, there were these two guys, Yegorov from Kantaria, who were honored as the official flag raisers. You know, Yegorov was a Russian, Kantaria was a Georgian, and that was the version that was no one knew Minin's story in the Soviet Union. The official version was Yegorov from Kantaria, and so in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a bit of discussion of these sort of, you know, Soviet myths, and there were other versions and more information. And Minin had his memoirs published, but it was still, I don't think, it's not something that really percolated through to the general public. And since Putin has really resurrected the cult of the Second World War, I think it's fair to say it's. I mean, it's a bit of a muddle, right? Because this version exists out there, but, you know, if you watch the parade on Red Square on the 9th of May every year, they talk about Yegorov and Kantaria being the two to raise the flag over the Reichstag. So I spent some time trying to unravel this story. I mean, I did an undergraduate history degree, but I'm not a historian by training. I wasn't really trying to establish the truth of what happened those days exhaustively, but I was there I wanted to kind of take Minin's version seriously, and I mean, I haven't seen anything that would really suggest that what he said wasn't true. So basically, to cut a long story short, what happened, I think, in those that period at the beginning of May 1945 was that Minin was in this sort of first wave. He got to the top of the building, but his flag was lost. There was still a lot of fighting going on. The German defenders of the building didn't surrender for sort of a day and a half, 2 days later. And Marshal Zhukov, the guy who was in charge of the capture of Berlin for the Red Army, he was clearly presented with sort of varying accounts of what happened, and he picked one, and everyone sort of lined up behind this account where Yegorov from Kantaria were the ones who'd done it, and that became the official version throughout the Soviet Union. And Mikhail Minin is this sort of very ordinary lad who was born just outside Pskov. And he was, it's difficult to imagine anyone, further from being a dissident, right? Or going against the system. He was, but this, and I try and track this through the chapter that I wrote about him as much as possible. This sort of dishonesty, this unfairness, the fact that him and his, the other soldiers in his group had been kind of written out of history. This clearly ate away at him over the course of the decades after the end of the Second World War, particularly as the war became more and more central to public life, under Brezhnev, and subsequently it became this huge sort of uniting political myth, sort of replacing the revolution. And he he went on a sort of one-man campaign to try and, he wrote letters to everyone he could. I think and I think he definitely wrote to Yeltsin, he wrote to Gorbachev, he wrote to all sorts of, journals and magazines trying to get his version published. None of them would touch it until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Minin himself eventually died in the early 2000s, still with no sort of his memoirs had been published in a sort of small print run. But I was sort of I was interested in this, exactly what you said, how this propaganda, how this truth versus not truth, what this does on a human scale. And I think his story reflects that. I spoke to in Pskov, his granddaughter lives in Pskov, and I spoke to her when I was researching the book, and she suffers from it. She said in school, they were taught that you got it from Cantaria, raised the red flag over the Reichstag. And she'd said, well, actually, no, that was my grandfather. And she was sort of, she was laughed at, dismissed out of hand. How that, ostensibly these things, a lot of these things, the Soviet truth, non-truth sort of ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it still very much persists. And the legacy of that for individuals.
I mean, it seems important. You mentioned that the victory in Germany replaced 1917 as the central myth in the 1970s. And that's still very much with us. It's underlying the war in Ukraine. To what do you attribute that shift in emphasis?
Well, I think... So what, as I understand it, obviously the revolution, 1917 revolution, was the founding myth of the young Soviet Union. But then after the war, after Stalin's death, you're in the 60s, this is almost getting on for 40 years after more than 40 years after the revolution, and people are beginning to realize this sort of communist utopia that they've been promised is not about to materialize.
Khrushchev had said it was going to happen by 1980.
Yeah, exactly. So this sort of stuff becomes increasingly ridiculous. The revolution is increasingly far away for a lot of people. But the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians call it, was much more immediate. Something everyone could relate to. Everyone had lost someone. That sacrifice, that victory. And it's very difficult it's impossible really to argue that it's something everyone could be proud of, right? And so it became this very powerful political tool. And if you look at how the World War II was commemorated, immediately after, there was sort of nothing, Stalin was not interested in commemorating it. It's Brezhnev really who creates this. He starts the parades on Red Square every 9th of May. He turns it into this big political myth, which sort of reigns supreme until the collapse of the Soviet Union, when it sort of goes into abeyance in the 1990s. And there's more discussion, obviously, of some of the terrible things that the Soviets did as well, and the mistakes that were made. But then Putin has very much refashioned this myth for modern Russia.
And of course, he grew up with that myth in the background.
Of course, yeah, exactly. That's exactly his generation. That's what they've always known. And obviously, it changes, because now there are no more veterans, right? When Brezhnev, embarked on this in the 70s, there were still hundreds of millions of people who'd fought in the war who knew. Now this myth is much more divorced from the reality of what happened. But it's still very powerful nonetheless. And we see in Ukraine, Russian units they seize a Ukrainian town, they raise the red flag, the Soviet red flag, over the shattered remains, right? It's you have Russian
nostalgic cosplay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's not just abstract debate about, what happened when. This is people are still dying for this. I
may be making too many overt Orwell references in this in this podcast. You don't actually reference Orwell in the book, but I keep coming up with these associations. So here's a quote from Animal Farm about Moses the Raven, who represents the Russian Orthodox Church, while the farmer Mr. Jones represents the Tsar. Moses, who was Mr. Jones's special pet, was a spy and a talebearer, but he was also a clever talker. He claimed to know of the existence of a mysterious country called Sugar Candy Mountain, to which all animals went when they died. So in the story, Moses deceives the animals before the revolution. Once the revolution happens, he's sent into exile. And then once the revolution fails, Moses comes back. It's an opium of the people idea of religion, that religion comes back in bad times. So Moses sounds like Russian Patriarch Kirill, right? Promising Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine that they'll go to heaven. How does he compare with one of your protagonists, Putin's confessor, Tikhon Shevkunov? Is Tikhon Putin's pet or someone more influential?
So Tikhon is this very interesting figure in the Orthodox Church. I write about him in the book because he was head of this monastery that we were talking about earlier, the Caves Monastery. Well, that's where he started his religious career as a novice in the 1980s, and he was appointed as abbot of the monastery in the 2010s, and he served there for a while. He's currently the Bishop of Crimea. And Tikhon is interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, he, as you said, he's widely known as Putin's confessor. This is something we can never quite know for sure because neither man will confirm or deny. But it seems quite likely that Tikhon at least had a role in bringing Putin into the Orthodox Church in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Whether or not you believe Putin is a genuine Orthodox believer or is sort of cynically using it is a different question, but it's undeniable that him and Tikhon have a close relationship dating from that period. They have to go on trips together. For example, Putin is, photographed with him and so on. Tikhon is also interesting, I think, because of his background. So he went to VGIK in the late 70s, which is Moscow's premier film school, still is. And he's not only famous as a cleric these days, he's far more famous as a writer. He wrote one of the most popular post-Soviet non-fiction books called Everyday Saints, about the Pskov cave monastery in under the Soviet during the Soviet period. He's also written plays. He's presented television programs. He's very prolific and is sort of trained in the arts of propaganda, if you will. Like it's not a very heavy-handed. It's quite a sophisticated propaganda.
A clever talker.
Exactly, he's a very clever talker. Exactly. And then also, he's interesting because of his beliefs. Like oddly, for a cleric, right? He doesn't actually talk about religion that much in his public interviews and appearances, of which he does quite a lot of. He's quite media savvy. And he's known. He's a nationalist. He's an imperialist. He's a sort of conduit for these, sort of extreme nationalist ideas that there's this sort of he's a representative of this sort of extreme nationalist group within the Russian elite. It's not quite clear where his imperialism, starts and ends. Does he want to see the Soviet Union restored? Does he want to see the Russian Empire restored? Does he think Russia should rule Constantinople? He is undeniably a proponent for imperialism. He thinks Russia's destiny is to be an imperial state. I don't think he believes Russia can't be an empire. And he's also deeply socially conservative, to the point where sometimes he tips over into sort of conspiracy theories. For a while, he was very obsessed with barcodes and the the satanic influence supposedly exercised through Bach. I mean, there's some quite odd
That's quite
esoteric
retro.
stuff.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think there was that went maybe. When did that sweep through the West? I think that was a thing in maybe like American religious broadcasting in the 70s or 80s.
Right. So he was a bit later to it. So I think you're like 1990s, maybe early 2000s. Yeah. And what, he's like, if you watch his interviews and stuff now, he's a very polished performer. He's very he's clean. He looks quite wholesome. Like he's very, but I did speak to some people who'd known him, 25 years ago, maybe longer. And there's one woman who had sat on a committee with him, and she said the only reference point she had for him was Rasputin, this famous monk in the late Tsarist period, just before the revolution, who had this incredible hold over the imperial family.
That Rasputin, yeah.
That Rasputin, yeah. Who was sort of debauched, and so that's what she, as immediate association with Tikhon was that, 20, 30 years ago, was that he had this, when he walked into a room, people immediately were focused on him. He had this immense charisma, and he looked kind of slightly depraved and debauched. He used to apparently drive around in expensive sports cars. So he's a very interesting figure within the church. Within the Russian Orthodox Church, there are very few people who stand out, apart from the patriarch, any clerics that have any sort of public sort of persona reputation to speak of. Tikhon is almost the only one, and he's often floated as the next patriarch. Who knows? But he's very powerful, and part of that stems from his proximity to Putin. And in the book, I think you can take him as the symbol of this the union between church and state that's really become entrenched under Putin. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Orthodox Church, which had been there'd been an underground movement to a certain extent. There'd been some official scope for Orthodox believers to practice, but the church hierarchy was very compromised by the KGB, and
that's where the spy part comes in. Yeah.
Yeah, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was like, what's going to happen to the Orthodox Church? How is it going to go forward? Is it then the new Orthodox Church going to be populated by these people who suffered for their beliefs in the Soviet Union, who went underground, who resisted the Soviet atheism, or is it going to be these people who are compromised by their association with the KGB? And it very much was the latter.
Of course, it was the latter. Yeah, yeah. So one of the recurring topics in the book is the shock of the 1990s in Russia, which you dramatize really well through details about collapsing industries, institutions, as well as the international borders that divided areas that used to be within the Soviet Union. The Kremlin also uses this sense of victimhood to justify aggression in Ukraine, atrocities. So how do you relate the shocks of the 1990s to the war in Ukraine?
It's a great question. I don't think well, I'll say this. So when I was, I worked in Moscow as a journalist for best part of a decade. But when I was researching this book, I really began to, the more work I did on it, the more I began to believe that, if you want to understand Putinism, Putin, and, by extension, the war in Ukraine, you really have to understand what Russia went through in the 1990s, and how people have responded to that. So I do think the 1990s is key. And above all, and people have different people obviously have different memories in the 1990s. For some, it was a period of hope. It was a period of change. And I think both that's very valid. But it was also a period of, immense economic hardship. In Pskov region, I might get this wrong, but I think between 1991 and 1996, the size of the economy halved. There was a 50% GDP decline for the region, which is, I mean, even during COVID, I think the worst year of COVID in the UK, it was about the economy contracted by about 10%, right? So it's that sort of worst year of COVID contraction year on year for 5 years. It's a really extraordinary figure, and I think quite difficult for people to get their head around who haven't lived through it. Inflation was off the scale. People lost their savings. People weren't paid at work. People had to queue in shops for, it was rationing, had to queue in shops for food. And I remember speaking to one woman who perhaps didn't even didn't really mention her in the book, but she'd grown up in Pskov, but she'd gone on to be quite successful. She had a business, I think, based in St. Petersburg or maybe Moscow. She said to me something like that: with each passing year, I look back on the 1990s and I'm more outraged about it. Like, she enjoys a good standard of living, a very, standard of living very comparable to, middle-class people in European capitals. And she looks back on that period, which was not that long ago, having to queue for food, of seeing her parents, made unemployed or just powerless. And it's kind of horrified by it. And that's a very powerful, I think, political force as well. And obviously, whenever I talk about the 1990s, I'm very wary of sounding too much like, Russian propaganda, because that is something, it's very much part of the Putinist narrative.
It stands to reason it was rough in Ukraine as well.
Yeah, rough in all former Soviet countries, yeah. And obviously that's how Russian propaganda, frames it, as things were terrible, and then Putin came to power and we had stability and economic growth, and everything was much better. Obviously I don't think it like that. I think of it in those terms, but I think that the impact of the 1990s is key. And then the other thing, what you mentioned about the borders, which I think is also very interesting. So Pskov region, as we were talking about earlier, Pskov region was, for a long time, it was on the frontier of the Russian state. But then as the empire expanded westward, it became the sort of backwater. And then the Soviet Union, again, the borders of the Soviet Union were quite a bit to the west. And then suddenly, after the Soviet collapse, this international border appeared again. So Pskov has sort of gone full circle, right, from being on the frontier of the sort of Muscovite state and fighting off Poles and Lithuanians or whatever, has now come full circle. So it is again perched on the edge of the Russian state, very close to NATO and the EU. But I was struck by the sort of lived experiences. So if you're thinking about the lived experiences of people in Pskov region, right? So if you've grown up in the Soviet Union, you could travel. There were no borders. You could travel to Estonia, to Latvia, to Lithuania, to Belarus. It's all right there. There was, standards of living were always a bit higher in the 3 Baltic countries, and people would go there. And at the same time, the Soviet Union, people in the Soviet Union, were being told by the West that, they were caged by, they couldn't leave the Soviet Union, and freedom of movement was restricted, blah, blah, blah. And then the Soviet Union collapses, and the people in Pskov region, they see suddenly there's this international border on their doorstep. Within a couple of years, you need a visa. So you need to apply for a visa to go to Estonia, say, and that requires traveling to Moscow and having money to pay for the visa. So very quickly, and coupled with the economic collapse, there's significant levels of poverty, and for most people now it's completely impossible to go to Estonia or Latvia or wherever for economic reasons, and because this international border has sprung up. So the sort of lived reality for people, and at the same time, obviously, it's just the arrival of freedom and democracy and capitalism, and people on paper have these freedoms to travel wherever they want, but in practice they can't, right? So the lived experience of people is this is very different from what you might think with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all the restrictions that went with it, and the limitations on freedoms. Freedom finally arrives. So what does that actually mean for people? And people's experience of that that transition, I think, defines how they see the world, and it's important to trying to understand what is happening today. So I wouldn't draw a sort of direct link between we lost our empire. Well, there is a bit. We lost our empire when the Soviet Union collapsed, and now we want to reestablish it in Ukraine. Although there is obviously that, the like.
Is that not exactly it? I mean, it feels like that is it.
Well, I think for people like Tikhon, for example, that is it. They want to reestablish the empire, and that I think the Russian elite, and I think Putin, they probably see it a lot like that as well. But I just think it's that sort of post-imperial syndrome, basically, which a lot of countries have. The UK has it as well, and it works out in different ways. And
not in going to war with Ireland, thank God.
No. Although the British state did kill a lot of people in Ireland, 50 years ago.
There was some trouble a while ago.
Yeah. So it's just how I suppose I'm not trying to downplay the significance of that sort of imperialism, which I think it is ingrained very deeply in a lot of Russians, if not most Russians. But it's just how that loss of empire, how that affects society and politics and so on.
Yeah. But there's also like a false antithesis as well. Like you don't want to go back to the 90s, do you? And therefore it justifies it's used to justify the nature of the current regime.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm sort of wary when I make this argument that I don't, I do remember people saying that to me the very first time I went to Russia in, the mid 2000s. It's like, look at Yeltsin and look at Putin. Of course, you'd rather have Putin. Yeltsin was this drunk guy, incapable of really, certainly at the end of his term. And it was embarrassing having that sort of leader, and the young Putin was much more appealing. But it is very much part of the regime. And I mean, the absurdity of the propaganda is that, Putin was the creation of Yeltsin. Putin's corruption and Yeltsin's corruption are deeply intertwined. Like it was a deal between the two guys that brought him to power, and to try and create this sort of space between the two as if they're kind of separate entities is rubbish. Very much the Russia that Yeltsin created is the Russia that Putin not just inherited, but in many ways took to its more logical conclusion.
Take care of Russia, as he said. I think exactly. when he resigned. Yeah. So many of the people you interviewed for the book support the war. Some of them are people that you're close to. One question that's been with me since 2022 is this problem of how you relate to people you once got to know well, who are now on the other side of a terrible international crime. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's tricky. There are quite a few people in this book who support the war, and I for the purposes of the book, when I was, I suppose, particularly when I was interviewing them or communicating with them, unless I suppose I switched into journalist mode. You want to get the most information out of people, you want them to be as honest as possible, and usually the way to do it is not to have a massive argument, right? So you'd sort of try and tease out information in different ways. So I think when I was working on the book, that was usually my approach, and to give people, each chapter of this book is usually devoted to one person. So trying to give that person space and a platform to talk about their ideas and where they come from and how they see the world and why they see the world that way. To be honest, some of the people I interviewed for the book I haven't had much, if any, contact with subsequently. There is one. There's one. The opening chapter of the book is about this elderly couple called Nina and Nikolai, who, I knew for many years, who were very kind to me for many years. And in the book, I suppose it's a sort of trick I play on the reader as I describe Nina and Nikolai's life and their kindness and what they've been through. Nina was, she went as a little girl, she grew up under Nazi occupation. Her father was killed in the war. Her family almost starved to death in the years after the war. And at the sort of the end of the chapter, I sort of, drop in that, they are now big supporters of Putin's war in Ukraine. And it's trying to understand how those two things, how you can support a genocidal invasion and war crimes on the one hand, and yet be a very kind and empathetic person in other ways, right? But I suppose that's you'd see this all over the world. But yeah, I know write about it back in the book. I find it very difficult. I don't, with Nina and Nikolai in particular, I never. They're much older than me. It was always a question of me sitting there and listening to their stories, which I was, always very happy to do. And I'd never really played the role of someone who would challenge their, belief system, and and often in these, often in relationships with people who support the war, it's like you can challenge them, but you're not going to change what they think. You'll destroy your relationship, and nothing will change. So I take different approaches to different people, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. With Nina and Nikolai, I'm still vaguely in touch with, but yeah, I think you just have to judge each individual circumstance. And yeah, I mean, I don't think I would have any close friend. I wouldn't have any close friends who was supportive of the war. I don't think that'd be possible. But Nikolai are more people I've known for many years and would keep in touch with. Maybe I don't know. It's a difficult balance to strike, I think. I don't know what your experience of it.
I'm thinking of the different strategies I've seen. So some people will break contact completely because it's too painful. Some people will observe a taboo. They'll just, if people have become very close, they'll just continue communicating, but not talk about the war and not to hurt each other. I'm thinking of a Russian friend who came to London after publicly opposing the war. He posts pictures of the devastation every time there's a Russian strike on Kiev, just posts it on social media. So at least the people who are in touch with him are seeing the consequences of the war. I mean, the imposition of a taboo, it's not going to last forever. I mean, you have to deal with it at some point. Orwell had this great quote in his essay, The Prevention of Literature. He says, even a single taboo can have an all-round crippling effect on the mind, because there is always the danger that any thought which is freely followed up may lead to the forbidden thought.
I mean, to be honest, I find that here in the UK, like I regularly meet Russians here, and I've kind of been surprised by the amount of people in the UK who, if not support Putin's war, but who, think it's NATO's fault, think all the blame lies with the West.
Oh yes, I've heard this from a lot of Uber drivers.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a fringe. I mean, it's a minority, but I'm not sure it's a fringe. So it's particularly interesting with other Russians, because there are also Russians around who, obviously in the UK who support the invasion, or who are at least sympathetic to Moscow's reasoning.
I've heard tell of Russian Orthodox churches in London where prayers are said for right. Kirill and the Russian armed forces. Yeah.
So whenever I meet a Russian, you do this sort of weird dance of trying to figure out what they think about the war. The war, like no one wants to say it from the word go, because everyone is aware that it's a taboo. It's a deeply divisive.
Maybe we should.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, and certainly in those cases, if I realize someone's supportive of the war, I'm not interested in. Eventually, it's one of these things, as you say, it eventually comes out. You can't hide it forever. Even if you don't talk about it, there are a million little cues people give, and you eventually figure out where on the spectrum people are.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Howard. That's probably a good place to leave it.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the book is Russia Starts Here, Real Lives in the Ruins of Empire. It was shortlisted for the Pushkin House Prize in 2025. The paperback is out in July from Bloomsbury. Howard is on X at Howard Amos, Instagram at Howard Amos. To support the Orwellians, please subscribe to the Orwellians Substack at theorwellians.substack.com or donate via the Stripe link in the show notes. I'm on X at Roland E. Brown, Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown. You could read my long-form articles in New Lines magazine. My book, Godless Utopia, Soviet Anti-Religious Propaganda, is getting a bit harder to find, but it looks like there are still copies on Amazon's US site. Thanks very much, Howard.
Thank you.